Well, Blind Sniper beat me in our little shoot-off, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do any work with him anymore. And this week, many more people can join us for our collaboration since it's something that can be done inside. They don't necessarily need to go somewhere else to do it. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the other channels that are going to be a part of this. The first I already mentioned is the Blind Sniper, then USNA98, Joe Morgan, and Guns, Gear, and Guns with Geary Gunderson. Now, if I'm missing anybody, I'll put a little note down here right now, just letting you know because I am recording this a little bit earlier. Okay, with that being said, I want to talk about something before we get into my 5 favorite movies, and that is that this is a favorite list, not a best list. There's a pretty big difference between something being your favorite and something being the best, and these are movies that are my personal favorites, not necessarily that they're the best war movies ever made. There are many movies that could be on this list, and there are just a lot of war movies that I personally haven't seen. These are my 5 favorites. And the first on this list is the movie Glory. Now, this movie might catch you off guard, and honestly, it did me as well, because it's not really a time era that I'm very interested in. But it is a fairly accurate movie about one of the first black regiments in United States history during the American Civil War. It portrays the war well and is pretty accurate to the original story, albeit with some liberties taken here and there and the occasional exaggeration. But which war movie doesn't do that at least a little bit? There are very few. It is a well-made and a very good movie, and it addresses some hard topics like racism and just other challenges that those soldiers faced at that time. We kind of have this idea in our head sometimes that if you were in the North, you didn't have to deal with racism, and if you were in the South, you did. But even back then, if you were in the North, you had to deal with quite a bit of racism coming from the government and coming from the individuals around you. For firearms, most of what you will see is either percussion cap rifles, like this pistol is percussion cap, meaning that you put a little cap right there, it's like the primer, and then when you fire it, the percussion cap will be like the primer and ignite the powder that's down inside of the chamber. So the rifles that were in that movie were single shot, and there were a number of cap and ball revolvers that are also in that movie. The second movies that I want to talk about, I kind of grouped these two together because they were made as a group, and that is Letters of Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers. Now, what I like about these two movies is that they show opposite sides of the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was in 1945, and it was one of the first Japanese territory islands that the United States started to take. Flags of Our Fathers came out first, and it tells the American side of the story. It specifically focuses on the men who raised the flag from the famous picture that was taken and what later became the United States Marine Memorial. And Letters of Iwo Jima follows the Japanese side of the battle. But what I like is that this isn't necessarily a simple case of one battle from two sides. They're both very, very unique movies. They focus on different details of the battle. And Flags of Our Fathers focuses on a lot of events that take place after the war. Whereas Letters from Iwo Jima does show quite a few events that happened with Japanese soldiers prior to the war. With the elements that it is supposed to be pretty strict with, from everything I researched, it seems like it is actually a pretty accurate movie. Now, this is where we need to talk about something. And it is that there are sort of two different kinds of war movies. There are war movies that follow a specific event and specific real-life people, and then there are other war movies that follow more fictional characters, but in that setting and could have really happened, like what would be historical fiction. And Letters of Iwo Jima does a lot of those kinds of things. In my opinion, between Letters and Flags of Our Fathers, Letters of Iwo Jima is the better movie, but they both are very, very good, and that is my personal opinion, not necessarily absolute truth. Flags of Our Fathers, since it follows the specific soldiers who raised the flag, is a little bit more strict with its historical representation, whereas Letters of Iwo Jima follows and makes up a couple characters that weren't actually real. What I think is really interesting is that where Flags of Our Fathers, the whole movie is asking this question, what is a hero? You see, the men who raised the flag, I didn't know this until actually watching the movie, but the men who raised the flag toured the United States and were seen as heroes by everyone. And the interesting thing is they weren't really that significant in the battle as a whole. They were just men who happened to be there to raise the flag. A movie I have behind me is Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge is a very good movie following a pacifist in the Second World War who saved a number of lives and ended up receiving a Medal of Honor. He was seen as a hero because he saved, I think, 30 men, if I remember correctly. However, these men were seen as heroes because they lifted a piece of cloth up on a pole. And I don't want to trivialize that action because it did play a major effect in the war in the grand scheme of things. And this movie really deals with the idea of what is a true hero. These men who gained recognition in some cases didn't really do great and glorious things to save lives, but other men did, and they didn't receive that recognition. And what I think is interesting is Letters of Iwo Jima kind of turns this idea on its head and is asking the question, what is a villain? In Flags of Our Fathers, we don't often see the Japanese, but a lot of the movie you're seeing from their point of view shooting out of a window. Or you'll see an artillery gun firing, but you just see the barrel, you don't actually see the people operating it. And Letters of Iwo Jima shows this side of the conflict by showing these soldiers and showing who they were, and showing that they were just conscripted men. There's a lot of nuance to who these people were, and that's something that's missing from a lot of war movies. A lot of war movies, and in general, just our attitude towards war is often, they were the bad guys, these were the good guys. But what I liked about this movie is that they humanized these characters. They were just normal people who were maybe conscripted to fight, or didn't expect the war to actually happen in the way that it did. The general that much of the movie was following in the movie actually quotes something that the real-life character did. He said that the United States is the last country Japan should go to war with, and he didn't think or didn't want them to ever go to war with the United States. But when they did, he served his country like many of us might be willing to do. Letters from Iwo Jima gave faces and names to otherwise normally faceless and nameless enemies. So all of that being said, I really liked Flags of Our Fathers and Letters of Iwo Jima, and personally I did like Letters more, but Flags was a great movie as well. Now, a few things I want to note, just because a part of my criteria is firearms, because it's something that I'm really interested in. This movie did have some unrealistic gunfire. There were times where you would see somebody shoot, and then you'd see them act as if there was recoil to the gun long after they actually fired. And just some of those kinds of things, and you could see that flashes were added afterwards, or they used blanks and the people didn't know what firing a real gun was like. And then the other thing for me is, this movie just had a lot of interesting firearms. Because I'm interested in World War II history, there were a lot of M1 Garands and M1 carbines. There were also Type 99s and those kinds of things. And I believe once, I even saw a late war Type 99, what's often called the last ditch rifles. This was a very interesting movie for firearms, but there were some mistakes just with, it seems like, from my perspective, actors not knowing how to act like they're actually shooting a gun. One thing I should note about the history. These movies came out in 2006, I think, which means filming happened sometime in 2005. And in more recent times, there has been some questions into the actual people who were raising the flag and whether or not those people were the people who it was historically believed had done it. And since that was a more recent thing, that doesn't make its way into the movie. I still think these are accurate movies because they were made with the information at the time, and these things are under question. They're not necessarily known. I believe in that picture you don't actually see any of the men's faces, and so there's not entire certainty about these things. All right, number 3 for my favorite war movie is Black Hawk Down. Now, as we're talking about accuracy, one thing we should talk about is that some people have called the accuracy of this movie compared to the actual battle in question. And one of the reasons for that is because this movie was based on the first-hand account of a book. And so if this movie was based on that book, and it follows that book perfectly, even if that book comes from one person's perspective, it may not have all of the details right about the battle. However, it seems like there was still pretty great lengths made to make this movie seem as accurate as possible to the actual events. And in a broad scale, from my understanding, it is, although they may have changed a few details here and there to make a better movie. Now, what this movie is about is the events of October 3rd and 4th in 1993, which was when the United States launched an operation that ended up in the Battle of Mogadishu. Specifically, this movie follows Army Rangers and some Delta Force operators. And one of the really interesting things that I like about this movie is it demonstrates the issues and the advantages with the tech at the time. And there's all these different points where the tech at the time plays a very relevant detail to the movie. For example, there's a part where a convoy is driving down the narrow streets, and they're trying to communicate back and forth with headquarters figuring out how to get back. They're lost in these Mogadishu streets. And while they're doing this, there's a delay between when they get back and forth. So they will be told to turn left on a street after they've passed that street. And that's demonstrating the issues with communication using the tech at the time. Even though it was high tech for the time, it was still quite a ways behind what we have today. We also see the Delta Force men having night vision and other technology like that, and that really does play a pretty major role into the movie. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a shortcoming of the movie, but since we've mentioned it with the movie before this, and it's going to come up later, this movie does take a pretty unnuanced approach to the battle. It's pretty one-sided. Americans are the good guys, and the Somalis, not the Somali civilians, but specifically the Somalian insurgents or terrorists or rebels or whatever you want to call them, are the bad guys. Again, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just the movie isn't trying to portray that side of things in the way that some other movies do, and I did think that that was worth noting. One of the things that I think is the most interesting about this movie is the weaponry. Now, the rebels are using AKs and PKMs and just different artillery and items mounted in the backs of vehicles. They are using technology that they had. They're using these surplus rifles from the Soviets. This is really in that time of the early global war on terror, and it's a really interesting era for firearms. You started seeing red dots mounted to carry handles. So talking about the American side, the Americans are carrying M16A2s a lot of the time. Now, I know this is an A1, but it's what I have. The Army Rangers were using 20-inch M16A2 rifles, and normally they didn't have any optics mounted on them. It shows the step above that the Delta Force soldiers are. They really stand out. So Delta Force is going to be, in that movie, having shorter carbines, and they're going to have aim points and lights on their guns, and then when it's time for night vision, they all brought theirs and are ready to go. So one of the most interesting things to me about Black Hawk Down is the use of these retro, really cool guns that were commonplace at that time, even though today they're kind of outdated. However, speaking of outdated, my number 2 movie is The Siege of JADOTVILLE. You might not have seen this movie. It's a Netflix original that came out a few years ago, and it tells the little-known story of the Battle of JADOTVILLE that took place in September of 1961. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it, and it is just very good. I very much appreciated it. Now, it follows an Irish company that is sent to defend the small town of JADOTVILLE. They're told to resupply with the equipment that's there, and when they get there, many of them, or most of them, had FAL battle rifles, but a number of them had Enfields. Now, this is a number 1 Mark III. They had number 4 Mark Is. Again, this is the rifle that I have, so it works as an okay stand-in. So they had these battle rifles that were high-tech at the time, serving alongside these old bolt guns. And when they get there to resupply, the stockpile that they are there to resupply with is from World War I. So they have a Maxim machine gun that they take and field in that circumstance. And this movie is actually very accurate to the actual events of the battle. The main character it follows is Patrick Quinlan, who is the commander of the company. And what I like about this movie, other than the interesting eclectic array of guns that are used, from bolt guns to battle rifles to a Maxim machine gun, is that it also tells a story that we don't really know from history. You know, if you talk about something like Black Hawk Down, if you say something like that, people usually know you're talking about something bad that happened in the 90s involving an American helicopter being shot down. They probably don't know all the details unless they've seen the movie and studied it, but they do know the general idea. If you talk about the Battle of JADOTVILLE, people are clueless. This is a very little-known part of history that actually did play a pretty major role in historical events. This movie is very well made, and I highly recommend that you watch it. Now, before we go on to number 1, I want to talk about my honorable mentions. And the first movie I want to talk about with that is Fury. I didn't put Fury on this list because it has quite a few fantastic elements, just some things that are historical inaccuracies with the way that tanks worked at the time. But I do think it is still a very good movie, and I think it portrays the attitudes and realism of World War II, even if it just has some elements that aren't necessarily incredibly accurate. The second movie I'd like to talk about is Red Dawn. Now, Red Dawn isn't on this list because it is not following a real war, it's a fictional war, but I do think that it showed a really interesting time in the 80s when it came out, and I do think it's just a very good movie, even if it's not necessarily a war movie per se. The third movie I'd like to talk about is They Shall Not Grow Old. This is a really good movie. Peter Jackson directed it. And basically, he took all of this footage from World War I that was in black and white and in pretty poor definition, and he balanced the lighting, colorized it, and added audio to it. It is a really, really good documentary, and it just very well represents the soldiers who were actually involved in this conflict. You know, we're so used to seeing World War I in black and white that it's sometimes easy to separate the war from the soldiers who fought in it. Next up is Battle Los Angeles. Now, what's interesting about Battle Los Angeles is that they basically made a movie about the global war on terror, but where the soldiers are fighting aliens in Los Angeles instead of insurgents in Iraq. They're using the same equipment and tactics that they use in fighting insurgents, but they're doing it in an American city against an alien force. It is just a very interesting movie and a creative concept for making a movie. The last movie I want to include on this list is Life is Beautiful. Now, Life is Beautiful isn't as much a movie about World War II as it is about the Holocaust itself, and it follows a Jewish family that was living in Italy and was taken into concentration camps. It is a very well-made movie, and it is a movie definitely worth watching, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a war movie in the same sense as these other movies. Now, on to my favorite war movie of all time, at least that I've seen so far, is All Quiet on the Western Front. I want to clarify that I'm specifically talking about the 1930 version and the 1979 version. Now, we talked a little bit with Flags of Our Fathers and Letters of Iwo Jima, that there are historical movies that are trying to talk about a specific historical event, and then there are war movies that are following soldiers, making up characters, and talking about their lives. And All Quiet on the Western Front is the second one. The book, All Quiet on the Western Front, was written by Erich Maria Remarque, who was a soldier in the German army. And although the story isn't necessarily about his life, he has a stand-in named Paul. And throughout the story, Paul is writing in the first person, and you can tell that to some degree, Eric is writing from his own personal experiences, although the story itself may be made up at times. While it is technically historical fiction, it is a very, very accurate portrayal of the war. And one of the things I like about the book and the movies, the earlier two movies at least, is that they don't necessarily talk about specific historical landmarks that would place them. It's just soldiers fighting in the trenches. There's no clear acknowledgement of where they are other than the Western Front, and they're just fighting. They're just fighting the French, fighting the British. They aren't necessarily talking about, oh, I'm a part of this offensive, I'm next to this city. And so because of that, this movie can stay fairly grounded and doesn't necessarily need to concern itself with the exact historical events. Now, for context, the book came out in 1929. The book came out in German, and by 1930, they released the movie in English. And the 1979 version was made for TV. And for being a made-for-TV movie, it's probably one of the best ones I've ever seen. Now, that does limit the graphic nature of what they're allowed to show, but the movie still gets across the ideas very well. The 1930s movie was very controversial when it came out. And part of that is because they implied two people having sex, which wasn't okay for movies at the time, but also the movie portrayed war as it really was. The movie was banned in Nazi Germany because it was seen as being anti-German, and it was banned in the Soviet Union because it was seen as being pro-German. It's really interesting, and I think it shows that Remarque really did accomplish what he set out to do. This is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. Now, all of that being said, I am 8mm Mauser Man, and, oh my gosh, I've spent a lot of time watching war movies, but I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
John.